Hey YouTube, S-Rank here. I'm going to talk about this guy back here, Wolverine. Don't have anything prepared. I'm just going to go off the top of my head. Hopefully that my thoughts are coherent and cogent and they make sense and I don't ramble too much. I'm going to find out. So Wolverine has been my favorite character as long as I can remember. I think there might have been a point where, oddly enough, Grifter from the Wildcats supplanted him for some reason. But for the most part, Wolverine's been my favorite character in comic books, and probably fiction in general. There also might have been a time where Snake Eyes from G.I. Joe was vying for that top spot. And I assume that he was my favorite character originally because he's Canadian, and I'm Canadian. There's not a whole lot of Canadians in fiction. It's a shame, but we don't have a lot of Canadians. Small population, 30 million, not a whole lot. Still would like there to be more, particularly in DC Comics, where Canada virtually doesn't exist, which is a pain in the ass, but to each his own, I suppose. So I came into comic books originally not from comic books themselves, and not even from X-Men the animated series, which or Batman the animated series. A lot of people probably got into that from the animated series in the early 90s. I got involved and interested. My interest was piqued from the Marvel trading cards in the late 90s and the late 80s and early 90s. My dad had a card store, and he was a big collector. He's still a big collector, particularly of non-sports memorabilia. But he would build his sets, and I would get the extra cards, and I would read the back of them. And some of them would have power stats on them, strength, speed, energy projection, and bios of the characters. You can read bios of the characters, look at their pictures, and compare their stats. And that's what got me hooked. And then in I think '93 they had the Fleer, I think it was Fleer Masterpiece line, where they got a bunch of classical traditional artists to do the artwork for the cards. It just blew my mind. I would just look at those cards for hours on end and read the bios. And then, of course, obviously X-Men the animated series was a big influence. Every once in a while, Pizza Hut would release a promo comic, and even though my dad didn't own a comic book store, he owned the card store, which was a big thing back then. He knew the guy who owned the comic book store, so we'd go in there and we'd talk to him, and I'd browse the back issues and look at the covers, and if I had enough money from allowance or whatever, or my paper route, I'd buy an issue if it had it. Usually didn't I did judge a book by its cover. If it had a cool cover, I might pick it up and take it home. And the first action figure I ever bought was with my own money was a Wolverine action figure. He had retractable claws, and he came with an Uzi for some reason. Don't know why Wolverine had a gun. He did in this. I guess they decided that would be a pretty cool action figure. I bought it, so I guess it worked. Yeah, so that's where my affinity with comic books and comic book characters started. And the good thing about these trading cards is they would have a lot of obscure characters. So even before I started reading, I had a pretty vast knowledge of who these characters were, and what their powers were, and what their capabilities were. Maybe some of the stats on the back of them aren't entirely accurate based on my experience after reading comics for a long time, but I thought it was a great way got me interested. Don't think they're too popular now. I guess I guess you have deck builder games and stuff like that. I don't know. Kids probably aren't really into them. But yeah, Wolverine's my favorite. Why is he my favorite? It used to be because he's Canadian. Not really the case anymore. And a lot of characters that I liked when I was a kid, I don't really like anymore. We did that video on Batman. Because I spend a lot of time thinking about these characters, more than I should, probably more than is healthy. So I think about Wolverine a lot, and I like, he's this great existential character. He has this great existential plight and journey, and he was created by they've gone back since then and updated his backstory and delved into his past more. But originally, when I was starting reading, we didn't know what his past was. He had been brainwashed by Weapon X, and his past had been erased. He didn't know who he was. He was the archetypal man with no name, and they had made him a killer. Weapon X and Department H and Department K. They had made him a killer, but so he has this existential journey to decide, how much agency does a person have? How much control do they have over who they are? Is their fate predetermined? Is it decided, or do you get to choose who you are? So Wolverine's on this journey to find himself and become a better version of who he actually is. And obviously, since they've gone back and delved into his backstory, we've learned more. So that it all predates the Weapon X program. He was kind of always this character after Wolverine Origins, when Rose was killed, and he kind of went into the woods and lived with wolves. He developed this animalistic instinct, this primal instinct. Maybe it was always there, just waiting to come out after the X gene activated. So that's some of the themes that Wolverine represents stem directly from that. It's this man versus nature, nature versus nurture. Which side wins? So there's a lot of duality, and I guess some people would say contradictions, but if you want to make a three-dimensional character, there's going to be contradictions, right? Because that's human nature. Not everyone, no one is internally consistent 100%, right? So these are the main driving forces of Wolverine's character. These conflicting dualities. Who wins? Does the Berserker win, or does the Samurai win? And then ultimately, neither of them wins. It's this struggle back and forth, always fascinating to me. I really like the existential characters a whole lot. So Wolverine has this existential angst and really self-loathing, self-hate. But he's trying to better himself. Ultimately, he's doomed to fail, because another theme of Wolverine is failure. He's a huge failure. Fails at virtually everything. Keeps trying. I think it was in Uncanny X-Men. It might have been in an annual where, Wolverine's about to kill somebody, and Nightcrawler steps in and he said, "Listen, you don't need to kill this guy. You can be better." And Wolverine's like, "I'm too old to change." And then Nightcrawler says something like, "You're too good of a man not to try." So that encompasses a lot of Wolverine's internal struggle to me. And then, Sabretooth in a lot of ways is just an external manifestation of everything that's going on inside Wolverine's head. They're very similar characters in a lot of ways, except for Sabretooth doesn't push back against any of his instincts. He owns them. So he's not right now. Don't want to get into that. Marvel Comics is a mess right now, but he owns his instincts. He owns his drives. He's unabashed. He loves it. And Wolverine hates himself, so he hates, as a byproduct, he hates Sabretooth. And they have this clash. And I like it better when Sabretooth doesn't hate Wolverine, and in fact he likes him, and he just wants to convince him, like, "Listen, you're the same as me. We're at the top of the food chain. We can do whatever we want. And I'm going to convince you, and we're going to live forever, so I have time, and I'm not too worried about it." I'm not interested in it when Sabretooth is completely adversarial and he hates Wolverine. It's not really interesting to me at all. I like it better. They probably went too far in Wolverine Max where it seemed like Sabretooth was completely in love with him. I think he called him "you're my soulmate." That might be a bit too far, but that's more in line with the essential conflict between the characters, in that Wolverine hates Sabretooth just as an extension of him hating himself. But he wants to be better, and he ultimately can't really kill Sabretooth, so it's like this. So it's the same thing going on inside of himself because of Sabretooth's healing factor. You have these two sides that are just in constant conflict, and neither of them can win. I mean, they can win temporarily, like I win the battle, but the war is ongoing. Keeps going on forever, which is interesting. Marvel Comics hasn't done a great job with the character in a very long time. I think Wolverine's probably a bit dark. He's a really dark character if you sit down and analyze him, and maybe he's too dark for traditional tights and capes comic books. I mean, they try to say the darker character, like Batman's not dark at all. He wears black, so I guess that's pretty dark. But he's not a dark character. Wolverine, the inner conflicts that and the themes that drive the character are dark. Like, he likes to kill people. He loves it. He hates it. He loves it. And that's part of why he hates himself, but he does love it. I think when Wolverine was fighting Sabretooth, I think this was the second time after Mutant Massacre and Uncanny X-Men, and Psylocke was reading their thoughts. You know, she just got this overwhelming joy of the battle, the conflict. They love it. They love it so much. But he has to decide, you know, am I a killer or am I a man that's going to fight these urges? It's kind of like a Dexter situation, I guess. But Wolverine's more proactive in trying to fight against it and better himself. Even though ultimately he just joined the X-Men and did it for them. Like, if I can't control it, I'll just channel it at a cause I believe in. So there's that. But so Marvel hasn't been doing a great job with him for a very long time. I would say the last great Wolverine story was probably Warren Ellis's Not Dead Yet, which was in the late 90s, I think. Ooh, that's a long time ago. Jason Aaron had a decent run. The Get Mystique stuff was all right. I like the ending of the Get Mystique. Was it called Get Mystique? That's what I'm going to call it. I like the ending a lot because it plays into the existential drive of the character, where he leaves her alive at the end because he chooses not to kill her, because he's more than Weapon X made him. He has agency in who he is, and he gets to decide. So I like that. The art was great. Task Force X, I think it was called, or was it Strike Force X? That was pretty good too. The Red Right Hand stuff really suffered from pacing issues, because basically every issue was the same as the last, just was a different, like, just flesh out the characters that Wolverine had wronged in some way and hate him, and they joined the Red Right Hand to get revenge, which is fine, except for you're telling the same story every month. We wait a month for each issue to come out. However long the story arc is, like 6 months, maybe even more. I'm trying to remember. But ultimately, you get to a point where you've been essentially reading the same issue for 6 months, which is half a year, and that can be irritating. Maybe it reads better in trade. I haven't gone back and read the Red Right Hand in trade, but for the most part, Wolverine's been kind of in this nebulous zone where they haven't been doing justice to the character at all. But Marvel hasn't been doing justice to the X-Men at all for a long time, because they have this mindset where they want to cut the nose off to spite the face, because they don't have the movie rights for the X-Men, so they don't want to give Fox anything to work with. Which is a shame, because as far as I'm concerned, the X-Men are the greatest comic book franchise of all time. And there was a time where that mattered, where they mattered, where they were huge. And Marvel's doing their very best to destroy that legacy. I'm hopeful that the upcoming relaunch with the blue and gold teams change that. I'm not confident, but I'm hoping they change that. There has been some good runs, some good X-Men and X-Force runs that Wolverine's been a part of, even though I think those are... I did like the X-Force run, the Kyle and Yost, and then the Remender afterwards, even though I think it's out of character for Wolverine to lead those teams. Because a big part of his character, like, he's a killer. He's a pragmatist. He'll kill somebody. He realizes that it's necessary. But part of his role in the X-Men is that he fills that role so everyone else doesn't have to. And we've seen in the past that he was even willing to kill to stop someone he loved from killing, because he recognizes the toll that can take. So him leading a team of killers in the X-Force, out of character to me, didn't really. I love, like I said, they were great runs if you remove that from it. But out of character, particularly X-23 being a part of X-Force, I don't think that is something that Wolverine would have ever gone along with. I think a lot of people thought that him becoming the head of the school was out of character, but I think that's more in character with the drive of Wolverine than him leading X-Force. Like, Wolverine going out on his own and doing it is something completely within character for him. But him being this facilitator for these characters doesn't jive with me. you know, I guess I don't see him in a spot where he would try to stop Deadpool or anything like that. But these other characters, these characters that he comes to think of his as his family, I feel like he would stop that, which he didn't. Which is all right, because ultimately they told a good story, and not everything can be 100% in service of one character, especially in a team book. But like I said, him leading the Jean Grey school and kind of the conflict with Cyclops, a lot of people thought that was out of character and inconsistent with who Wolverine is. I completely disagree. I think that's much in character with who Wolverine is, because part of, like I said, part of his drive is that this is the role he's there to fill in the X-Men, to make so that the other characters don't have to fill it. So a lot of people didn't like the conflict between Cyclops and Wolverine, but that worked. That worked for me. I didn't hate that at all, because, you know, it's like Wolverine's like, you're supposed to be better than me, Cyclops. Because part of Cyclops, like, who are you to come up to me and judge me for what I'm doing? And then Wolverine's like, buddy, you're supposed to be better than me. I'm here to make sure you don't have to cross these lines, and you cross these lines. And that's not only a failure on you, that's a failure on me. So I always thought that was interesting. I don't think it played out as well as it could have, but I was intrigued by it. And then, of course, he died in a very anticlimactic way. Wasn't a huge fan of that. He's been dead for a while. Old Man Logan's filling the void, and X-23 is in the Wolverine role, the traditional Wolverine role. Don't hate that. The run hasn't been great. The all new X-Men, it hasn't been great either. But I don't hate the idea of her filling that role, even though there's a lot of these legacy characters. I don't even know if I necessarily want to call them legacy characters, because it doesn't feel earned. You know, like we have Falcon as Captain America, and Miles Morales as Spider-Man, and Lady Thor as Thor, Hulk as Hulk. I'm sure there's more. Riri as Iron Man, and then of course X-23 as Wolverine. Kind of, I might do a video on this. Kind of a pain in the ass to have them all operating at once, doing, in a lot of cases, complete disservice to the characters. But I think from X-23's mind space, it makes sense for this character to kind of want to step into that role of Wolverine, the void he's left behind, and try to find herself in that role. As you know, she's been kind of a daughter figure to Wolverine, but she's also a partial clone of Wolverine. So there's story threads there that make sense. I don't think they've been telling an interesting story. I don't really care about the X-23 clones like Gabby. They're pretty boring. But there's a story there that they could tell if they were willing to tell it. Doesn't seem like they are, which is a shame. Yeah. So Wolverine's been, even before he died, he's been suffering in Marvel Comics for a long time. And I think it's, like I said, because he's a dark character, and even though he wears a yellow costume, why does he wear a yellow costume? I guess he's probably, in gamer terms, to pull aggro when he goes into battle with the X-Men. But I really wish they would sit down and do him justice. And I know a lot of people, even if they don't like the X-Men movies, they like Hugh Jackman in that role. I'm cautiously optimistic about Logan. Not sure if I'm confident it's going to be good, because I think Fox they have an even worse understanding about who Wolverine is than Marvel does. But they have the movie control of the character. They haven't, like, a lot of people like Hugh Jackman in that role. He's done some good performances. The character he's playing isn't Wolverine. Doesn't bear any resemblance to him at all. I guess sometimes the hair is right and he has claws. I know, and I'm not talking about his height. I don't care about that. The superficial character features, really. But the essence of the character, they haven't been able to nail it. They haven't captured the existential angst. They haven't captured the self-loathing. They kind of got it a bit at the beginning of The Wolverine, and then they completely went out into left field and destroyed that movie in the last third. It started out pretty good, which is why I've been hearing that the first 40 minutes of Logan are great. And that's good to hear, except for the first 40 minutes of the Wolverine were great. It's a shame about everything that happened after that. Yep, so that's about it. Can't really remember everything I've touched on, but I think that's about it. Might do something more later if I realize I've left something out, but I think that's everything. Peace.